Hello everyone, today we talk about the 13th century Western European mounted crossbowman. As you can see, there is no picture for your great delight, because I haven't managed to find copyright, say, usable picture for this. Normally I do. I mean, it's plenty of art that is uploaded and can be used with the references that you see normally as a list of the Creative Commons links at the end of my videos. But so this is not the case. I just used the guy you've seen here in the thumbnail from Jan Heath's drawing, and that I readapted and colored a little bit, and that's good for fair use. In any case, it's not much of an issue. You know that I'm coming back with the military stuff after quite a while. You know that I've gone through a certain period in which I wasn't fully okay, and I thought that the manualistic content was kind of more, more suited to that situation. Of course, we'll continue with that as well, but now I am back on track with this stuff. But I think that you don't care, because at the end of the day, when I make these videos, they're very technical, and they can't illustrate even in detail everything. So I guess you just listen to them when you're doing other stuff. You don't watch all the the pictures all the time. Albeit they're cool to watch, right? When they pass by, and especially if they are pertinent, etc. So I'm also working to find some solutions. Maybe finding some artists can help with their work, but it's not the main problem with Farpoint, I guess, and at some point I could even re-upload some videos if I couldn't find the pictures or something. It's not much of an issue, again, because it's today's topic, which really calls for a bit of criticism and a bit of reflection at length, because we're talking about these military units, right, from medieval warfare that are kind of very specific, almost wargamistically listed. I have created properly a playlist where you have all these various troops, troop types described, and of course they are categorized in this way. Why the mounted crossbow in the 13th century, right, in Western Europe, and not only, also in Central Europe, as we will see now, among the Western Slavs, because generally speaking, medieval warfare is really simpler than it seems, right? Many people approach it as if we were more complicated or complex. In a way, it is. We will see now. Historically, it is, meaning how to find information that we start having plenty of compared to ancient times, and that the Middle Ages always had in that regard. But let's say people seem to be more familiar with ancient warfare than medieval warfare, and so think that the latter is somewhat more complicated. And since, I don't know, Europe was more fragmented, that were more differences. Actually, it wasn't like that. But there are some regional scale dynamics that are definitely there. Very often we tend, again, to over-categorize, so probably today we will try to debunk this thing a little. First of all, crossbows, as you know, revived during the High Middle Ages to reach this full integrated in the 13th century. That was in fact a moment of great professionalization. Fundamentally, monetary economy kicks in to stay at a consistent level. We're at the peak of feudal warfare, right? And so also the specialization of not much the specialization of cavalry per se, but at least some types, and its functionalization with some troop types that had always existed, but that start becoming more consistently framed in this multi-arm military system that makes, in fact, an increasingly synergic use of all the various elements on the battlefields. And crossbow warfare, I think we made only a video about, I don't know, I think it was on the 10th, 11th century Western Frankish crossbowmen, so digging a bit into the revival, properly, the beginning of the revival of the crossbow, that, however, in early medieval Europe had always been there, right? It's not a loan from the crusades or whatever. It just followed from the development and functionalization of European armies at the time. Became, however, a very important and massively destructive weapon on the battlefield, especially in anti-cavalry function, especially among infantry, so much that there is also some kind of, it's in part even a class weapon, let's say directed against the knights, the nobility, etc. But let's not overdo, also because at this point cavalry and infantry always fought together, especially at this point. You actually have some of the fullest integration, again, of the various arms with army, essentially cavalry battle lines that are flanked, essentially protected laterally by this, thick infantry wings equipped with also ferociously effective, in fact, anti-cavalry weapons, and that had also to fight against their counterparts in the front and fall on the flanks wherever the enemy infantry wings collapsed in the same way. And there is, say, the mounted crossbowman is an interesting figure because it's instead a bit of a hybrid. And it's not an extremely common troop type. It was always there, because these troop types are always present in some number, even when they're kind of unusual. It may be the most unusual, after all, in terms properly of bodies of troops. Right, you have surely more foot crossbowmen and more, lancers on foot, and more heavy cavalry, or at least some kind of medium cavalry that is meant still for shock. That is more numerous than the mounted crossbowmen, and they pose a problem also for the doctrine and the practical employment of the same troops, because using a crossbow from horseback is not particularly easy, nor this troop typology, in fact, considering numbers, was dramatically impacting on the same battlefields, right? And the concept is not so difficult to get, but you have again to contextualize it in not just in the warfare at the time, but necessarily through the sources of the time, because we don't know the former without the latter. And believe me, I also made videos about this in this array playlist. We haven't really gotten medieval warfare that right as we think yet. There is plenty of things to say more and still. So the idea of a mounted crossbowman here that we get first of all from the sources is that we're different, differently stratified types of crossbowmen, mostly regarding their own, the heaviness of their own equipment. We find the top elite guy, like the one I used in the thumbnail, that is essentially equipped just like a knight, except for the shield that, handling a crossbow with both hands, we see also from the artistic depictions, unsurprisingly isn't quite there in the representations. We'll talk about properly the shooting techniques later. But essentially it's a knight. It's a heavily armored horseman that in the 13th century starts appearing also in the illuminations, etc., because there is this phenomenon, especially towards the end of the century, where the knights began to be sided with by mercenaries, by other troops that, albeit not knightly, were still as heavily armored, in part because of the professionalization of warfare, because the world was becoming richer, and also because, in fact, you wanted an ever more elite quantity of troops that will bring, paradoxically, by the end of the 13th century, also in part to the reduction of the same mounted crossbowmen on the long run. We will explain it also now in a while how. So obviously the advantages of a mounted bowman are readily evident. And there were mounted archers in Western Europe throughout all the Middle Ages, right? There weren't a particular, type of a particular country. The fact that later on, the English longbowmen in part were also mounted because they were used in skirmishes and ambushes and so on, and a great part of troops were on horseback during the march and so on. Doesn't mean that that was a doctrinal choice, right? It was not specifically about England. Mounted archers are depicted everywhere at all times. They're just not that frequent because at that point, a missile trooper normally is a light trooper, which means being heavy or light is not a difference of how heavily armored you are, but how much you can hold the ground against an opponent. Meaning, crossbowmen normally were, or archers, mounted or dismounted, were light troops because, if just even a lancer, right, both on horseback or on foot, attacked them. Normally, they weren't equipped to, trained and armed in general to fight against them in hand-to-hand combat, and so they would retreat. This is obvious, right? It's like skirmishers in general in ancient times. Essentially, they're replaced by the crossbowmen in high medieval times. If you wonder where most skirmishers ended up historically, why you find javeliners just in siege warfare in medieval times, is because factually this other kind of troopers had substituted them. There are also other reasons that have to do with the disarming of the population in the feudal world, for which you have also probably tougher troops in the first place. So mostly heavily armored and hand-to-hand combat design. This is especially evident when you compare the Crusader forces, stereotypically at least, against the Turkic ones or the Egyptian ones. They were more similar, especially with the Egyptian ones, than we think. But generally speaking, there's this idea that the West becomes ever heavier because its society, its feudal society, has been structuring and kind of engineering, right, a greater improvement in quality as opposed to quantity, right? And this is obvious, right, because the feudal society is one that there are just a very few rich guys at the top, and all the others just work, do not fight. And so armies approximately do not resemble entirely that, because of course the elite is represented by only by the heavily armored. That is a real elite. And there are the peasants, there are people who are much more likely armed. But overall, right, compared to other systems, it's a fully feudal society most of the time. You have, like, there are commoners, communes, and things like this, but still they're heavier. Right. Also, the communal troops normally are heavier because the city-states were richer, and so they could afford at least more material and also more training. So it went in parallel in many ways. And generally speaking, in warfare, the less, the better if the quality manages to compensate for that, because it also poses much less problems that now we can't digress on. So because of these changes, where even the traditionally lighter troops are happening, and the battlefield is becoming ever more armored in many ways, it's readily evident that the crossbowmen had to become more performing from one side, but also had to be ever more functionalized to take down that specifically heavy element, right? That again was not fully possible because, let's say, even if you pick the average crossbowman that would make up the infantry, it's not that would easily manage to take out, as light infantry as it was, doesn't matter how powerful the crossbow was, a heavily armored horseman, right? Because also consider that armor, generally speaking, worked well against the kind of bolts that it received, right? Which doesn't mean that the crossbow could also penetrate mail, etc., but in certain conditions. Like, of all the arrows that fly on you and that hit you during combat, right, most of them are not arriving like at a full 90-degree angle. They have already lost an important amount of force, etc. So you will manage, right, to get out of most of those without significant injury if you are very well armored. So mounted crossbowmen have, and the infantry normally doesn't face cavalry frontally, right? It's not really normal, right? Cavalry faces cavalry, and infantry is just supporting cavalry against other infantry, and sometimes, yes, taking even cavalry charges, but in normally emergential situations for which, especially in the 13th century, infantry doesn't go out there to face cavalry alone. There are very few instances of that, and in the 13th century especially, none that wasn't eventually successful because of the eventual intervention of friendly cavalry in support that would harvest the victory, tactically speaking. So it's obvious that mounted in this scenario, first of all, mounted missile troops do not seem to have much place, right? Because you have a bulky, heavy cavalry thing that, again, as a missile trooper, as lighter troops, you're not supposed to cope with normally, especially if you are functionalizing in using just a missile weapon, which, as we will see, is not necessarily the thing, because a mounted crossbowman here could be even just a fully equipped knight who could use a crossbow as a side weapon, right? So here we're trying to make the effort of conceiving the possibility of a more specialized trooper, which existed. Right now we will read also a list of all the instances in which they were used, at least, some of the most famous, and also looking at the numbers. So they were there, right? And the general picture makes you understand that it's obvious that in a pitched battle they would be of relative use, whereas in the normal campaign operations, so again, exploring, reconnaissance, raiding, skirmishing, all these things, they, mounted missile troops were very useful, right? So that's a context where you wanna have a guy who, is quite mobile, can get out of this situation as quickly as he came into it, and it can shoot something so powerful like a crossbow shot. In open field, of course, if we look at the role of squires and other attendants, as it had been historically, very often were lighter troops that were not meant to engage in hand-to-hand combat, that would still do anyway, which was also kind of normal, especially when the enemy broke and, there was the bloody pursuit, the moment in which most people died. But they were fundamentally just very close to their masters. They shouted to them, look, watch left, watch right, because helmets were enclosing, especially at this time. There's the great Helmian developing. It's very difficult to see, to hear, even to breathe sometimes in those helmets, because the engagements are quick, right? Many people say, no, everything was fully functional. Well, these people could make pirouette and other stunts in heavy armor. Well, yes, they could, because they were normally hyper fit people who just did that all the time, but it's not that they would normally dose energy like that, right? It still was extremely fatiguing to wear armor, right? Even to breathe, right? And just because we know that actual combat lasts a few minutes, right? And you have to pull back and line up again and launch the charge while you're, afterwards, when you have recovered strength. So the situation is also quite disorderly often, right? We made videos about, the Battle of Bouvines. We've seen there is this inherent, let's say, conflict between the collective discipline and the individualism of the knight, because they were good for both, but of course collective discipline is superior to the individual one, and so the great effort that requires also greater resources and training, etc., is, put ever more, especially in this century, in that, to enormous effect. But a lighter trooper there would come quite close to their masters to bring them, to help them, maybe also in combat, to pull them out of it, also when they reach the line, to give them something to drink, or giving them a fresh horse, or another spear, because normally also they broke during impact and so on. And so these people had necessarily exposed themselves to the point that it was obvious if their masters had enough wealth to armor them as well. So in a sense, it's easy to see how that gradual hemming of non-knightly troops also occurred. It's obvious that for a role like this, that is mostly the one of support, a mounted crossbowman does make sense, right? And it does make sense for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the crossbow is more powerful than a bow, right? And especially it requires less strain to use. So there is no comparison in practicality. Even the rate of fire, especially on horseback, is complicated because in order to get a very good shot, you have to have a degree of stability. And on horseback, it's not that easy. So even though you can surely have a higher rate of fire with a normal bow, or even with a long bow, you can still miss more likely on horseback than to make the crossbow ever more a better option than fighting on foot, right? And especially if we're talking to target an enemy heavily armored trooper, you really want to use something that pierces the damned coat of mail, that can in this sense knock out the elite with fewer that would be normally used, and in theory at a safe distance, because with the being, even if you're heavily armored as a mounted crossbow, you can come out of the fight relatively easier, probably because you have slightly less equipment if you're functionalized just like a missile trooper than a knight that is for melee. Naturally, everything is blurred, but you understand that just like we find similar tactics in other times in history that were basically coping with the same problem. Think about, I think about the English Civil War. Think about the lobster helmets, or still cuirassiers, etc. You have still, aside from caracol tactics that were fading at the time, but in general, this very close range shooting, right? Hopefully shooting at the head of the guy with a pistol, because still the helmet was very effective against most shots, and really you have to shoot him at the temple, hoping to essentially pierce through and get to the brain and knock him out, right? And that's the heavier guy that is usually also a better trooper, maybe a nobleman or something. So with the crossbow in medieval times, it's a bit the same thing, presumably, right? And the fact that these guys are heavily armored shows you that probably they were the minority of mounted crossbowmen. But the fact that they figure so prominently also in art is probably connected to this top role. That is, you want, in order to come dangerously close to somebody who can chop you to pieces, to be very well armored. And still, the crossbow at close range is devastating. You don't want to take a crossbow bolt in the face. And consider that in the 13th century, in fact, not all cavalry is fighting with the fully enclosed helmet, that there are further specializations also among this kind of, like the sergeants of the mercenaries, etc., that use things like the chapelle de fer, which is open, or something else. Some troopers, some knights even could fight raising their helmets. Again, we have instances of these things happening. It's not prudent, but there are some instances where it was so hot that knights would take off their armor, prefer to fight with their padded one, without the iron one on them. So it's an actual issue for which you can see how easy it is to find among all these intersections the right moment to inflict that close range crossbow shot against somebody, right? And however, it is still a minor role, because the shock force of a mounted knight is still much greater than anything that an equivalent number of mounted crossbowmen can achieve. The same reason why a dismounted knight was, more performing than a crossbowman. Otherwise, they would have had just armies without heavy infantry also properly the heavier one, not just knights, but lancers, etc., would have made all crossbowmen. Guess why it wasn't? Because they are light infantry. Light infantry can't perform that role, right? And I hedgehog of pikes, and the general role of heavy infantry is better than the one of missile, right? There is no army at this point that is made up entirely of missile. It's all combined arms, right? And if you have to rely on something, it's better to be a heavier type of trooper than a lighter one, right? Costs more, okay, but numerically you see that normally at this point in high medieval Europe, the crossbowmen, mounted and dismounted, they're never more, let's say, than they're hardly more than even the same knights sometimes. So especially if they are mounted, which is important because you understand that accuracy is important, and so a foot crossbowman is kind of more effective in a sense, except it fights from a greater distance, and it fires hopefully in volleys, which are not always easy to keep during combat altogether, but still is meant to do that collectively. Whereas especially the elite mounted crossbowman, the heavily armored guy, is there for precision. You want really to shoot you at a close range in the head or in the chest, or that's the point. So that's a bit the role, right? And that's the reason why there are a few of them, because light mounted crossbowmen, or bowmen for that matter, would have had even a less effectiveness than a dismounted one, than an infantry one, because of the obvious lack, the lesser degree at least of accuracy, and ever less so of precision when on horseback. It's kind of obvious, right? So you prefer just to have infantry siding the cavalry for doing that, also as missile infantry, than somebody mounted. But again, there were also other theaters, less meaningful ones, because strategically the most important one is the pitched battle, because that's the one where you concentrate forces, you functionalize them, and in fact you don't really much hear of mounted crossbowmen during battles, which is another interesting thing, that when you reconstruct battles of this time, you know that in these armies there were mounted crossbowmen, and that surely there were some there, but it's possible that in these battles also there was practically and hardly a systemic use of them, because forces would be mostly concentrated to strengthen the force of the heavy cavalry and the cohesion of the infantry, and that's how what the chronicles tell you about these engagements, right? Whereas you know that in an ambush, in a skirmish, etc., of course, a mounted bowman was a much more useful trooper, right? So that's the kind of doctrinal idea of why they were there. Now, as you know, we have very early evidence of mounted crossbowmen, for which we will make another video about, say, 12th century crossbowmen. There is we have for England, some mention at the time of Henry I. It was, again, absolutely normal. There always were mounted bowmen and crossbowmen, always at every single time throughout all early medieval Europe, right? These are not things that you have to spot specific evidence of. This is something just because crossbow was there, cavalry was there. There were these kind of troops. Point, right? It's a fact. It doesn't matter even to find the evidence. It's normal not to have evidence or open or abundant evidence about these things. It's just military logic. The quantity is important though, right? So one should also explain, however, in perspective, why do we see this increase? Well, we were seeing, of course, together with the increase of the use of crossbow, also the importance of it, its performance, right, its improvement in performance, and also this increased need of coping against armor, right? You have a lot of that. Consider that crossbows are anti-cavalry weapons, not much because they're anti-armor per se, but because they are anti-horse. Mm-hmm. So horses were hardly armored during this time. Padded coats were common for the horses, but full armor, for metal armor for the horse is something very tiny in quantity throughout all medieval warfare, also the late one, compared to the other types, and it starts appearing with certainty exactly towards the late 13th century, at least with clarity. Probably it existed already before, even plate, which we say, oh no, because plate appeared at a certain point. Well, we have evidence of, I don't know, the Byzantines speak for the Hungarians having some chest plate for cavalry, for horses, in the 12th century, at the Battle of Sirmium in 1167. But it's obvious, even there, what's the point, right? It's not that people were stupid that they wouldn't have an armor, right? A metal plate to put on the horse. The point is what you wanted. Well, you wanted to have that trooper to be heavier. Was it in terms costs, benefits, ratio, advantageous? Right, that's why armor begins to, appears or disappears or intensifies, let's say, more throughout the ages. Right, that's the only thing. It depends also on again, on the cost of it. That depends also on the people and the structures of the society. But let's say more than else, shooting on a horse was a much more effective mean to put an enemy knight out of combat than we normally think. Of course, knights would have spare horses, we were saying before, but falling from a horse is a big deal, right? We know of shocks, probably, aside from all you can imagine broken legs or backs or necks for that matter. Going on horseback is terribly dangerous, but the just the impact per se, right? Just the shock of being in combat, and we have instances of this, of knights losing conscience when falling, even just if they didn't have permanent damage really, but the shock of it, right? The moral impact, things that we're not even remotely habituated to dream of, fortunately or unfortunately, because also we have no resistance to threats and other issues, were there. This is the mounted crossbowman role in combat. But the obvious point is that, first of all, we have to define who is a crossbowman, a mounted crossbowman specifically, and whether he is going to fight on horseback or not, and whether he's going to fight with a crossbow or not, because that may not be the primary weapon, for example. So, for example, in France, that is a bit the center of the entire Western military developments, at least, especially as far as cavalry was concerned, we get the general impression that these mounted crossbowmen mostly operated as infantry, as a matter of fact, right? So as mounted infantry that could move quickly, especially in frontier areas, and to garrison castles, right? That defending a castle was terribly easy, and that crossbow was a very effective weapon to use in siege warfare. So let's say on a frontier you had this, as we'll see now, these salaried troops that were starting to appear properly from in the most powerful realms, like France, in fact, as permanent troops that could simply rush whenever an attack was waged at a fortress, so that it could have enough, say, crossbowmen that were mounted just for speed purposes to reach the theater of combat, and not because they were to fight as mounted crossbowmen, which naturally doesn't mean that they wouldn't either, right? Especially in a frontier context where you have these skirmishes and raids, etc. So you have this garrison, but this garrison can sally forth and make a sortie, etc., and or intrude in enemy territory, etc. So you understand the role, and these troops would be habituated to fight in all fashions, right? Because normally, and especially as professionals, whoever has a weapon knows how to use it in any context, right? Not just hell, it's a crossbow. You can use it on horseback, right? It's not that comfortable, as we will see, but it's witnessed and it was done. And in France, the military significance of these mounted crossbowmen was highlighted by the fact that they were paid more than a sergeant à cheval or even a non-noble cavalryman. So their specialistic role, in fact, they had their own specific capacity to, that even was connected to the crossbow rather than the at that point the speed, because if this is compared to other horsemen, that factor is null, right? So it's quite interesting because it shows how probably also in open ground these crossbowmen had an important role. After all, just imagine to approach somebody who has a crossbow, and that especially can run after you, and that he's not going to to score his hit quite likely, but it's still a thing you want to keep yourself away from, that forms that deterrent capacity. They also say, oh, watch out, because it's dangerous. Not that the battlefield wouldn't be dangerous, that these people were there to avoid confrontation, and physical, pretty physical one. But again, a crossbow could sometimes perform dramatically against even the better armored guys that more or less tended to say, okay, our strength derives from the fact that not just we are individually well armored, but also that we advance all thickly packed together, and so we have an exponential deterrent. Well, the crossbow bolt doesn't give a damn. He's going to arrive and strike you, right? And again, it's not likely to be that effective in general, because otherwise that would have substituted heavy cavalry entirely, but it still can claim its victims. We know that in between 1202 and 1203, Philip II Augustus of France maintained 257 knights, 267 mounted sergeants, 80 mounted crossbowmen, 133 unmounted crossbowmen, and about 2,000 sergeants on foot on the Norman border, the hot frontier, right? There were also 300 mercenaries under a noble locally, but this section is important. You see here, the mounted crossbowmen are not many, right? They're just basically 1/4 or even less than the knights and the mounted sergeant. There are more foot crossbowmen, who thus evidently didn't have a horse, and other 2,000 sergeants on foot, so we can think normal, like spearmen or something like that, are types of melee infantry, right? So again, it's not a huge number, but it's really this kind of more than a handful of mounted crossbowmen that you can throw in certain circumstances, and especially if they are many altogether, they can thicken that fire, they can increase that volume of fire and cause damage, especially if concentrated against, I don't know, a single guy. Let's say it's risky and tough, and the crossbow has an important reach and so on. Naturally, of these 80 mounted crossbowmen, we wouldn't have to think that the majority, or the entirety even, was armored. Likely they weren't, right? Probably all these guys were somewhat segmented within themselves. It may have been that maybe the mounted crossbowmen specifically were more likely to be armored than, say, the sergeants, for example. It's debatable in practice. We just don't know. But let's say if somebody had to be armored in that sense, it might have been positive for the same reasons we were saying before, to come close to the heavily armored guys as well, to have been effectively damp. Naturally, from the knights we expect they were all heavily armored. Mounted sergeants kind of medium armored in a way, and we are considered at this point at the beginning of the 13th century. So compared to the end of the century, where there was much more metal around, it's likely that here still a poor world in many ways, that metal costed much more than later on, than in a few generations. So we can imagine even the power of crossbows would have been importantly effective against the unarmored personnel. Naturally, the favored employment, right? The most common troop type that you meet is the unarmored one. So you can easily strike against them these bolts. At the same time, however, there are surely missile troops among the infantry that you want to, cope with the disadvantage against which you have, because they are on foot and they can aim better. They are more normally, and so that's yet another reason why the mounted crossbowmen would have been more armored than them in proportion, because at that point, the closer it comes, the more effective the crossbow shots are, and at the same time you want to protect the guys better though, right? And as we've seen, they costed more than the sergeants and the non-noble cavalry even. So this does support the idea that they were probably better equipped, better armored than them in some way, right? Philip II was able to maintain these men for quite a long time. They're not a huge amount of troops, but for the time being, just France really could afford such a thing in its effort to, contend from the Angevins, the great parts of France, and he would disband them only, in fact, when Normandy was conquered by the Capetians. So this little permanent army performed well in the defense of the border. We also know the English had something similar. In 1200, King John of England sent 84 mounted crossbowmen to France, 26 of whom had 3 horses and 51 had 2, while the rest had only 1. And this is yet another interesting segmentation, because it shows you likely the ratio of the armored with the unarmored, because knights, horsemen with 3 horses were normally knights, were normally the heavily armored. And here, out of 84 mounted crossbowmen, you have 26, which is not even that few, that have 3 horses. So this does show, as we were saying before, more than 1/4 were probably heavily armored, which again was surely not the case among the sergeants. And that supports what we were theorizing before. Also 51, so almost all the rest of them, had 2 horses, which again is a big deal. Okay, but it may not have been, maybe they were just run scenes in part, but let's say still, right, the rest had only 1, and that was normally what just squires kind of had. So you understand automatically that these mounted crossbowmen were something more than cheap throwaway skirmishers on horseback, right? So this is really important. Also, in the Near East, in the Outremer states, the Crusaders employed a very important amount of these guys, because they had to compensate for the mobile firepower that the Turks mostly opposed to them in larger numbers, and that's the reason why there were so many Turcopoles, for example, in the crusading armies that in part were perhaps equipped with crossbows, right? And maybe there were as many Turcopoles, actually not even just locals, there were crusaders or even other Western mercenaries. So again, there is kind of an elite character or a higher quality level of mounted crossbowmen appearing, especially in these two important the most important feudal states in Europe, France and England, that also again you see fight each other in some of the most advanced militarily organized fashion of those times at the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century. Consider also that the crossbow was a sort of novelty in large numbers at the time. As you know, Richard Lionheart is credited to have introduced the crossbow in the English armies. Actually, of course, it's false. Crossbows had always been there, but it's fair to say that Richard had maybe increased largely the amount of crossbows because of his crusading exploit, because of this intense campaigning against the French. Yes, it's possible that he was responsible for that in large number. This shows that, of course, crossbows before that time were less numerous, and in a sense, however, it also shows how their number would escalate with the escalation of warfare. In the same way, right? So it was a matter of functionalizing their use, right? And ironically and sadly enough, as you know, Richard would be killed by a crossbow bolt. Now, speaking of other lands, it's also quite interesting. So, crossbow technology was being pioneered, especially in countries like France, Italy, in part also Spain, that in many ways up to the 11th, 12th century was even more technologically advanced. And this is something that is often forgotten than the two aforementioned countries that eventually kind of kept leading military technology, at least during the High Middle Ages. Then the thing shifted a bit more towards Germany and Italy. And in fact, it's interesting to see how mounted crossbowmen spread also in the rest of Europe. So as for the crossbow in general, people used to say, this is something mostly that came as a Eastern influence, like the trebuchet, the crossbow, etc. This is all something the Westerners took from the East. There is not a single evidence of this. I've studied for years this context, and what I see is that it was just a revival of weapons that had always been there, and that were simply being put in larger use because the local powers were expanding like crazy, and creating ever more professional and larger forces. So again, even in the tactics, in the methods, in the performance, there is no evidence that the West was kind of copying a system from somebody else. On the contrary, if anything, it's later on, from the 12th and the 13th century at the latest, in an evident way, that the West was exporting massively its own warfare in the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean. What is more correct to say instead is that the intensive, heavily armored warfare that Western Europe was intensifying on average just more than the rest, right? Because also in the rest of Europe, the Mediterranean, the Near East, what was happening, the same thing in many ways, but it was due to its own feudal character. So it's obvious that the eastern you go, both in Europe or in the Mediterranean, and the more you find less feudal societies that relied more on number than quality, and therefore also sometimes of volume of fire by missiles. So it's obvious, like, pick the Iberian Peninsula, how much the ala Hineta kind of cavalry warfare with these knights still habituated for a longer time to use the javelin, something that in Europe by the 12th, 13th century was disappearing on a regular basis in the battlefields, remain, right? Because they were fighting against enemies like the Moors, etc., that made greater use of that, and so they had partly also to compensate, because also the same Spanish society was kind of more similar to that in terms of internal balance. So everything was done because of the local, again, cost-benefit ratio, right? So nobody was, intelligent and the other was stupid, as a dichotomy. They were all pretty competent in their own stuff. And this dynamic of, say, having more missile troops whenever you had to fight against enemies that had more missile, more volume of fire, say, is proven also by that particular branch of medieval treatise that have to do with the crusade, with the idea of how fighting the Muslims in general, that flourish a little bit also after the end of the Crusades, with the fall of Acre, at least in the Near East, and that are a bit late for this time, but do definitely insist on the importance of having more archers and crossbowmen, including on horseback. So here we are a bit of a later time, in 1305, in the Liber de Fine, written by Raymond Lull, who explains how a fleet commanded by an admiral was ideally, it is a prescription to transport 100 knights, 100 mounted crossbowmen, 50 crossbowmen, and 1,000 foot soldiers in galleys, which is a very balanced, let's say, composition, right? The typical 1 to 10 in terms of knights, infantry ratio, but there is also this 100 mounted crossbowmen and 50 crossbowmen, right? Which is also, like, for northwestern Europe, say, this thing of having 50 crossbowmen over 1,000 foot soldiers is kind of, maybe it's not that enormous missile force, but still you see the 100 mounted crossbowmen. Also in the Liber Recuperationis Terre Sancte by the Franciscan Fidencius of Padua, written between 1274 and 1291, by the way, across east and west, because he had been living much in the Holy Land as well, the author doesn't miss to provide with detailed and original tactical indications, among which the advice to employ, quote, an infantry armed of lances capable of making wall or disposing in hedgehog, and to recruit archers, say, mounted archers and crossbowmen. Right, so this is quite interesting, and I've been studying also other works written in the first half of the 14th century, especially in the crusade against Smyrna, against the Turks, which also many Westerners participated, and you could interestingly read this thing, that the idea of having sound infantry and bowmen, mounted or dismounted, that this is relatively indifferent, mostly dismounted, because that's what the Western norm was becoming, as we will explain in a while, was there, and not only, but also contingents from countries that normally employed like a different balance of troops were sent to Turkey fighting against the infidels with that ratio. Right, and this is what the chronicles say. Let's say, I don't know, countries like Italy, where normally there were armies always with cavalry and infantry, let's say in 1-4 ratio. Well, oddly enough, when they have to send these contingents against Smyrna, they use something like, I don't know, they're almost all infantry plus crossbowmen. Right, in a large number, and the idea there is that, of course, if you have to cope against enemies that have large masses of horse archers, you want essentially to stop them with heavy infantry with pikes that really stops cavalry, as Fidencius of Padua was saying before, plus crossbowmen that can counter the enemy shot, which is also what the English and the peasants did jointly at the Battle of Arsuf, as you know, against the Ayyubids, where, you know, the English knights eventually countercharged against the Turkish cavalry, scattering it, and the peasant crossbowmen were presumably on the wings of the crusading cavalry, managing to halt them also with stopping infantry, and beating, by the way, in volume of fire, the Turkish, in this time the Islamic horse archers, which is really interesting because it shows that also there were, independently from the evolution of the art of war, development of the art of war, still some important systemic differences that, of course, during the Middle Ages were maintained in different regions. And why did first of all, is there any other evidence of this era? Of course, we will talk now about Italy, for example, how it was there. But there is this idea that the more Eastern type of fighter is more provided with horse archery of some sort. For example, there is an appearance in late 13th century Italy of Hungarian light cavalry, right? Some say, especially in southern Italy, as some sort of mercenaries, I presume, that the Angevins would bring from the Balkans, that would normally operate as mounted infantry, which is something you see later on. The Balkans always had this kind of troops. Think about the Stratiots later on that are hired in mass by the Venetians. This idea that some were indeed mounted archers or gunners, and Hungary, the steppe, etc., always having these troops coming also sometimes from who knows where, simply local Balkan people that had just adopted that kind of warfare. For example, after the destruction of the Byzantine Empire in 1204, there were plenty of Greeks who went to fight for the Western Crusaders in the Near East, becoming Turcopoles, which had not become much of an ethnic thing, but just a type of trooper, right? Tactically specialized as such. There were lots settled in Cyprus and so on, and that were also heavy cavalry, for example. So that tells you how mixed this whole thing could be. Interestingly enough, okay, this thing of Italy, of Hungarian cavalry, I personally found it in the second half of the 14th century and later on, where, especially in northeastern Italy, you have lots of troops of German, Slavic, and Hungarian origin that pour into the northeast, mostly from Carinthia, Carniola, etc., that, interestingly enough, are often kind of Germanized, or belong to some German lords of southeastern Germany, and that do not appear among the German mercenaries normally operating in the same Italy overwhelmingly and virtually only as heavy cavalry, instead from areas like, say, Austria, Swabia, Rhineland, etc. So it does seem that, and that's the only area where you find those types of troops, like in the northeast, coming from those places, which makes you suggest that, and there were lots of mounted crossbowmen there. So the obvious thing there is thinking that the local cavalry was habituated to fight as mounted archers, and that when crossbows came about, they were employed also in substitution of the bow. And about this we should and could, and we will hopefully open a huge parenthesis, but in another video, about the alleged superiority of the bow over the crossbow, that has become like a mantra and everybody believes this because of the 100 Years' War, and not even studying properly the battles of the 100 Years' War, right? Fire rate is not everything, and there is really not, it's just wrong to make it a technical difference between the type of weapons, right? Because there are too many other factors. You can't really claim that the military system was this or that because either the longbow or the crossbow. What we see, generally speaking, is that certain areas of Europe, when they're exposed to the longbow, they keep using crossbows, which were pretty much universals, right? So if this thing had been the top thing ever, which was not, it's not the case, right? If you study the 100 Years' War battles, you see that very often crossbowmen were a dramatic disadvantage against the longbowmen for reasons that had nothing to do with the weapon. It could be number, terrain, even a severe disadvantage and misuse and other issues that simply from the sources we can't even reconstruct properly, right? But it's become the longbow wins over the crossbow. That's actually not an intelligent remark, right? We see that in many ways these weapons, in the way they were doctrinally employed, because technology is zero, doctrine is everything, were pretty much the same. How basically weapons, and especially at this time in history, say military systems have always been the same. There's not a dramatic difference in outcome. And even major battles can be really the fruit of so many other factors that are normally not highlighted, and that are easily, once you analyze those battles from the sources tactically, just somebody didn't want to see them for reasons that at that point are not history, as you understand. But just to make an example, when the White Company starts fighting in Italy and scoring all those successes with John Oakwood, etc., Italians do not adopt the longbow. And you know what? Italians were producing longbows, especially from Lombardy, where in the pre-alpine areas woods had a very specific temper because of the specific climatological temperature excursion of in those forests, in the forests in those places, and exported longbows to England. Did Italians ever use longbows? No, they produced them. They were the finest longbows the English bowed. Did they use them locally? No. Why? Right? These are questions that you cannot answer by saying, yeah, well, but it's just look at the Battle of Crecy or look at the Battle of Poitiers, as in Cook. It doesn't matter. It's not how you make comparisons, right? Just abstracting technology from the context, the worst thing you can do, or even extracting the same military thing from a political, social one, and pretending that a system is better than the other without context and without explaining why still it was advantageous for some to keep using a certain system. We have the evidence of mounted crossbowmen in Poland, for example, as early as the 12th, but surely before. Even there, crossbow had always existed. The fact that also the Western Slavs and Eastern Europe as well would have more bows than crossbows doesn't actually mean that there weren't crossbows ever, that a steppe rider wouldn't use a crossbow normal, just because, right? The traditional weapon was a composite bow. Again, different systems functionalize themselves in different ways. And there is always a reason that is intertwining. That is to say, it's not about the knowledge of a technology or a weapon that makes that, right? These systems could have easily switched to other weapons, in a sense. It's just there was no point of them in doing that. But again, finding a mounted crossbowman in Europe was pretty normal in general, as much as finding a mounted archer was. And what we wouldn't say, okay, consider that in the later Middle Ages, eventually mounted crossbowmen would be, the norm, as also the retainers of the so-called Lanxess units. Normally were these kind of mounted troopers, and the role would be pretty much the same, especially in this much more skirmish kind of warfare that the longer dragged wars would just of the late Middle Ages would bring with them. We've seen it even with the English chevauchée in France, etc. And speaking of the third country here we were listing, however, before we come back to... by the way, yes, this is a point I wanted to make, is that, again, being a knight, right, who wants to use a side weapon like a crossbow is completely normal, right? We have been convinced that the crossbow at some point was banished, that the papacy issued the banishing of crossbows because that was trying to eliminate crossbows from warfare. That's a complete misconception of what that specific issue was, and how also the nobility coped with that. What the establishment in Europe was worried of, the seculars, the ecclesiastical elite, is that in the moment of greatest spread of heresies in the 12th century was also the moment of greatest spread of crossbow in accelerational terms. As an anti-nobiliar weapon could be a threat to themselves, right? So nobody cared if, let's say, a knight used a crossbow, because they always did. The same Richard Lionheart was skirmishing with a crossbow himself before he was hit by a crossbow bolt in a siege context. So actually knights, in terms of chivalry, couldn't care less about this stuff. This is just a myth that has been fabricated by very idealistic chivalric literature that we interpret as if it was reality, but it was not meant even at the time to be a reality, and everybody who wrote that knew it. It was not a mystery for anyone. It was nothing concealed, right? In the form it was concealed because the idea of using a bow was considered unloyal, right? It was considered it's not face to face as two warriors, heroes should fight, right? And so the mythology of all the Indo-Europeans always told kind of this kind of lower beings that kill the heroes by betraying them with crossbows, because they don't even have the guts to go fighting in hand-to-hand combat with them, and they're always creeping out throughout all history because there were always these weapons around. And of course, a knight knew how to use every single weapon that existed at the time, easily, right? They knew how to master perfectly every single type of weapon. It was not even one that wasn't mastered. Every single one, even the peasantry ones, they all used them. The crossbow, too, right? So the fact that they wouldn't normally be depicted like side weapons like crossbow, what doesn't mean anything, right? They used it, and it could be useful. Just because you may want to bring a crossbow with you, independently from how you fight on horseback, by the way. And you would often fight dismounted as well. And yes, you can shoot a crossbow from horseback, right? It can be useful, and you may want to do that. Again, especially as we've seen, if you are particularly well armored, you can afford to come close to an enemy that you can hope to pierce in that way, especially if he's very well armored too. Coming back to the third example here, I mixed cards a little bit. I could organize the script better, but let's say, who cares? The Italian example. So in 1190, and here we have a lot of interesting information as well. In 1191, in the pacts that intercurred between the commune of Asti and the Del Carretto Marquis in Piedmont, appeared this reciprocal help of the contractors of the two sides of knights and archers cum equis, that is to say, with horses, while the Marquis of Saluzzo also committed himself to mobilize with 10 knights and with 10 arcatoribus de cavallo, which means essentially mounted archers. And there is another alliance that is signed in 1204, so the same years, remember, of Philip II, John of England, etc. Between the commune of Alba, these are all Piedmontese examples, and some branches of the Aleramic marquises that established to upkeep in common contingents of, quote, milites et equorum arcatores, that is to say, knights and mounted bowmen. This arcator here means like bowman, right? So it can be also crossbowman, right? It's not the Latin term is not specific, because the term ballista is used both sometimes for the crossbows and the ballistas, meaning as artillery, so the larger crossbows for siege warfare. So we are exactly in the same years at the beginning of the 13th century. You see all over Western Europe there are the same typologies of troops appearing here. They're not large numbers, as we've seen, of mounted bowmen, but still consistent, right? Compare, especially in terms of the ratio with knights. And again, they costed a lot. These are little communes in Piedmont, so they could afford this thing. It's extraordinary. From the second, with the same numbers, even not of more than one of kingdoms, we realize that. So how also intensive warfare was in certain areas. So from the second decade of the 13th century, archers on horseback are already substituted by crossbowmen on horseback in Italy. In 1225, Genoa, for example, rendered available to Asti a retinue of, quote, ballistarios equitantes, which literally means, in fact, horse riding crossbowmen, which sounds pretty much like, yes, they can horse ride, but they would also fight as dismounted crossbowmen, right? They're a bit like the dragoons of the situation. And again, mounted crossbowmen, we'll see it now, would always be employed with this kind of multi-task capacity, right? Both on horse and on foot, because it's obvious, right? And again, just for a shooter, being more firm on the ground, especially if you have a horse next to you, can jump easily. You can't shoot at distance. And get away. It's really functional in many military situations. The mention of mounted crossbowmen is ever more frequent during the 13th century in Italy. At least from the first decade of the 13th century, also Pavia in Lombardy had provided to form a corps of shooters, among which around 100 among mounted archers and crossbowmen chosen among the inhabitants of the villages in its territory. In 1252, Pavia commits itself to provide to the Marquis of Montferrat, together with 100 knights, also 25 crossbowmen on horseback, repeating this proportion that appears elsewhere of, in fact, one mounted crossbowman every 4 knights, which probably suggested by reasons of tactical nature, and that shows again this minor but still significant amount of mounted crossbowmen associated properly to heavily armored combat as well. So this is kind of as a typology of troop. Here I said 100 knights, but it's more like militas in general. So they could have been a varied, let's say, not sergeants, but there could be different types even there of heaviness in a way, but still that's the function fundamentally. From the second half of the 13th century, some Italian cities started to deploy companies of mounted crossbowmen as well. And even in here, there doesn't seem to be any external influence. Some Italian historians back in the day thought that this could be a response to the high mobility of Frederick II's Saracen archers, being a sort of mounted infantry who rode into battle but dismounted to fight. There's no evidence of this, right? This is something that English authors have copied as well and have said, but there's no proof of that. On the contrary, there is this important evidence and continuity in the use of mounted crossbowmen in 13th century Italian armies in the north since the beginning. So this thing of the Saracen mounted infantry is quite interesting as far as the army of the Kingdom of Sicily under the Hohenstaufen was concerned, but doesn't seem to have impacted Italian communal warfare that was already pioneering military technology and tactical development in ways that are objectively not to be found in the Kingdom of Sicily. It was still largely feudal, and that even though Frederick II of Hohenstaufen's court splendor made shining in a cultural, scientific sense, still wasn't as developed at all in practice in terms also of military organization, and that was actually also undergoing a crisis at the time with the employment of ever larger amounts of German mercenaries, as also later the same northern Italians would do. And in this wake still of heavy cavalry as the core of the army. Still, the Saracens were useful because they were a bit more kind of, infantry kind of type and kind of bit more specialized in that kind of missile infantry, but they were mostly like pioneers or something, and they weren't, say, a force that ever significantly substituted itself to the system of feudal army like the Sicilian one. But historiography keeps repeating these things because very often people read stuff from books, but they don't actually verify that. They say, this guy said it, and then why don't you say maybe it's not true, right? Because there is no evidence. You see, military history is a matter of measure. as most history, because it's not that we have direct certifiable evidence quantitatively, etc., to just say it's it, right? You have to use your brain more often than not, because otherwise we would just be copying each other. We would have not have any improvement historically. We find these pairs of knights and mounted crossbowmen in different ratios, but in very large contingents, such as in the one of Charles of Anjou in Rome in 1264-1265, before his crusade against Manfred of Sicily, where the Capetian deployed this Italo-Angevin contingent of 6,000 knights, 600 mounted crossbowmen, 10,000 foot crossbowmen, and 10,000 infantry, according at least to the Genoese annals, that however were quite informed also because they were connected with the Angevins very closely also for this, for the troops transportations and so on. So that's a hell of a, composition, by the way, because probably there were also, these were mostly Italian troops actually, right? And the knights were also largely French, right? So it was a combination. You find here 6,000 knights, which is enormous, by the way. Actually, this is some of the largest armies ever mobilized in medieval times. And you see here that mounted crossbowmen are 1 to 10 compared to knights. And they probably functioned as a sort of skirmishing troops, some sort of vanguard or explorers or something, right? And that was very important when you marched through, especially with such a large force, avoiding being ambushed or something in valleys, mountains, and so on. It had to happen in that specific context. Also, a dramatic amount of missile foot soldiers, which probably have to do with some Genoese element there, because they had plenty of crossbowmen at that point, probably provided them. Another random contingent in later in this context here is that the Charles Vicary in Rome and in the Sabine era could deploy at a point only in that instance, the contextualize, but just to show you here the numbers, 70 men at arms and 80 mounted crossbowmen among French and Provençal troops. So you see here even more mounted crossbowmen than knights in certain instances, and probably suggesting that even in such a condition where such a few troops were present, the mounted crossbowmen could increase sensibly the effectiveness of the force. It's just an idea, and possibly these troops were just bonded in some sort of, like, this mounted crossbowmen were meant to operate closely with the men at arms, maybe even individually. And so you understand in 13th century Europe how normal it is to have this real small amount, or in relative terms, but still somewhat greatly cared for mounted crossbowmen contingents, right? They were there uniformly. They were used more or less always in the same guise, in the same organically. They were always more or less the same proportion, and they seem to have had a very high quality value, especially as professionals, quite surely, possibly with a higher degree of armoredness in this context. Now, speaking of using the crossbow on horseback, this is an issue. Let's say it's possible to shoot a crossbow from horseback, also with some proficiency, right? This can be done if the horse is stationary, for example, or also at a full gallop, right? All the modes. Those who have performed this state that normally is a trick when in motion, that is to keep the bolt in place by holding its tail with the tip of your thumb over the knot, right? So the tail protruding a fraction above the clove, the knot, and the light pressure being all what is required. Another method would be to use a bolt retaining clip, but this slows the loading which is dangerous in, costly and undesirable in a military context, and especially in such kind of a complicated one, right? Just thinking, for those of us who ride motorcycles, how difficult it is. Just you want to keep things under control, right? A horse just goes on its own. You don't have to keep it standing, but controlling your stuff and being precise and retaining control of the situation around it's not easy, especially when there is a death threat around, right? Or something potentially deadly and dangerous. And the more pressing problem is the business of spanning as well. Now, the types of crossbows here are also interesting to observe, because at a later date, this mounted crossbowmen seem to have used a crow's foot lever mechanism, so-called. However, the illustrations of mounted crossbowmen dating to the 13th century invariably showed crossbows with stirrups. So this would make you think that they were mostly mounted infantry, as we have seen previously in multiple examples, and so that these guys were mostly meant to dismount. However, the cocking of a crossbow by this means, while attempting to control the horse, cannot have been easy. In any case, it seems likely that where possible, the butt of the crossbow was secured against waist or saddle, for example, and the string pulled back with the hands, right? And this seems to be supported by a 13th century source known as the Speculum Regale, which specifically states that horsemen carried the weaker types of crossbow, that is, the one you would essentially draw with your hands, justly, which, quote, in fact, a man can easily draw even when on horseback, right, because of the lack of this mechanism. Mounted crossbowmen, so consider that the cocking mechanism is essentially using a crank, right? The crank simply wind the handle until the string latches in place, right? So it's like you just pull this thing with both hands and assisting the guide, much like a rope cocker does. A cranking device reduces the draw weight and physical strain that comes with manually cocking a crossbow, of course. So this lets you pull the string more evenly and ensure the serving is centered, but it requires this additional mechanism that perhaps on horseback was way more complicated to use effectively, and so because there are mechanic parts you have to fit properly, so it's not that easy. And again, the fact that probably most of these troops fought dismounted is obvious, right? Albeit there are depictions in a number of contemporary illuminations of firing from horseback. For example, this picture I've used comes from the Roman de Gérard de Roussillon, that shows this, just using the crossbow in hands on horseback. And speaking of armor, also many illustrations again show this full mail armor and helmets as well, by the way, but no shields normally, again, because the shield would complicate dramatically any loading maneuver and would be, just incompatible in practice with that. And as we've seen, like knights, such heavily armored troops had from 2 to 4 horses in the 13th century as well. So this is, again, more obvious for the more heavily armored mounted crossbowmen, who were probably also people of higher status of some sort, right? Some people of some greater capacity and or status that would be very highly prized as at the same level of knights. And as we've seen, some equivalence of the ratio in some contingents suggests this being not the norm, but still frequent and compatible with broader thing. So it's the formation at this point in history of what would evolve like in the Lang's system, for which the knight would become, let's say at this point it's like the secondary horseman, the squires, etc., would become ever heavier and reach the knight. Then the knight would go beyond, while the other trooper now beginning to specialize in some other ways. It would become still lighter compared to the heavy knight, right, and more functionalized, especially in these roles. But it would take some time. In fact, it seems that by the end of the 13th century, the presence of this mounted crossbowmen, that, as we have seen, was not ever particularly large, were always a consistent minority in practice, was increasing because heavy, let's say, we're reaching the critical point of medieval military development in many ways. And what happens is that the more powerful states at this point manage to put together ever greater forces of heavily armored horsemen and to essentially make their own armies about them. Right, you have seen at the beginning of the 13th century there, between the Capetians and the Angevins, how small, after all, even the garrisons were. We're talking about a few thousand men, right? It would be normal for countries at the end of the 13th and the first half of the 14th century, the most powerful ones, to have things like even 5,000-6,000 mounted, heavily armored horsemen, right? And this was achieved again through mercenarism, etc. But in practice, they would be mobilized not even so rarely, but just for the major wars, right? And as a consequence, in this enormously expansive and loaded context, investing, what you see is that states prefer to invest and could afford to invest to core in just heavily armored horsemen. So there was no space for other guys, because if you could pay for the shock cavalry type, you would prefer that over the mounted crossbowmen or other lighter troops. It's true that there always were, but if you make an analysis of the army's compositions and even about this cavalry, while it is true that the terms are a bit generic, they tell you milites normally in the sources. So again, as like before, we don't know how many of them were, let's say, segmented, how many of them could be maybe even crossbowmen. But the sources do not actually tell you that mounted crossbowmen were much a thing, right? You know that there was some kind of lighter trooper there, but when sources speak of this milites, you understand that they're, even just in the way they were arranged in combat, like they were in the battle lines. They clashed frontally against each other. So that's it. You don't find ever the mention of those crossbowmen. And interestingly enough, some of the same sources do. For example, remember when we talked about the Hungarian troops or the Carinthian troops with crossbowmen in this period in Italy, for example. Well, the same chronicles that in great detail and amount of information describe literally hundreds of engagements and armies and expeditions, etc., and that talk about those crossbowmen coming from, in the northeast, never mention crossbowmen elsewhere. So they're the same people, the same authors that know those crossbowmen, that talk about them, feel the need to specify that they were present there, and you practically don't find anything else in the entirety of the rest of the forces. So that makes you think, as we've seen, that given that most of those guys were German mercenaries at that point in Italy, those mounted crossbowmen probably were just something typical of southeastern Germany in the Slavic-Hungarian border, influenced by steppe warfare, Whereas, I don't know, in the Rhineland, they didn't use it. And we are sure that in the Rhineland were mounted crossbowmen employed by the German forces. It's just we don't see them. Sources do not tell us, and therefore we have to come to the conclusion of some sort that even though these troops existed, either they could be, again, crossbowmen, because some of them could pass through the crossbow in some chances, but they would operate as normally as shock cavalry, or that maybe they were still a minor component of these troops, and that all that concentration of militas equated, however, still to the shock corps, and probably also to the numerical corps majority, let's say, to the sum of total, because otherwise you couldn't explain why sources would specify it, and also multiple sources at a time, not just some sources would count mounted crossbowmen in the east, in northeast, and not elsewhere. It's not really clear, right, why or should have not been the case. So I think that there was, especially in this much, let's say, neglected late and less very poorly conceptualized end of the 13th and first half of the 14th century, actually a massification, I don't even know how to say that, of heavy cavalry in a shock function that eventually declined, starting from the mid-14th century crisis, to give birth to what we see as the lances instead. So with, if you want a refeudalization of warfare, you see they're going backwards at this point. By the 13th century, in the 13th century, we're working to be all heavily armored in practice. With the crisis of the mid-14th century, again, you have the tactical distinction, again, of the mounted, the heavily armored guy, and then the more lightly armored troops. They're going in reverse. And so what we know, generally speaking, for Europe, the lances in France, Germany, Italy, and so on. So this core of ultra-heavy guy, which is getting ever heavier, and its support, very often in the guise of a mounted crossbowman, is more like a product of the late Middle Ages, and whereas there was this time of extreme concentration of forces that also coincides with the peak of medieval civilization and its collapse also from a military point of view, that Europeans recovered from by making this more functionalized use and more kind of combined arms use, in a sense, at least at a small unit tactical level, that in the broader development of the previous generations had been abandoned because it was just about the mass of the entirety of the horsemen, right? So it's and also much more infantry reliant in a sense, because infantry in a sense even lost further power in the mid 14th century before it was revived, as you know, in a sense of in an artificial way, in a certain sense later on, with the noblemen paying for it rather than commoners arming themselves. So this is the picture I get, and how you can frame mounted crossbowmen in the broader development of the art of war by the 13th century. And surely, one thing that just to explain you how history is made, like the mounted crossbowman is a very common figure, again, in as we've just seen throughout the entire video. It's known. Historians know that they are there, that the thing, even just as a typology, was normal. The problem is that it's so normal that you can't really have an entire work, like a PhD thesis, written exclusively on them, because they are present all over Europe. So nobody actually owns the competence to write such an enormous work looking at literally at the sources of entire Europe. Even if we're just for the 13th century, nobody has that expertise. Nobody, right? There are too many. You can't achieve that, right? Not even in a lifetime to functionally write something like that. And therefore, also considering that these mounted crossbowmen were evidently not decisive per se. So let's say one thing is studying again the knight, right, the ultra heavy guy, and so that is also the top of society and politics, so it's more easily conceptualizable. The mounted crossbowman alone does not exist, because as we've seen, it's just a support arm, let's say, and therefore this discourages and prevents factually from having a comprehensive study on mounted crossbowmen, saying, I want to understand how and why they developed throughout all the Middle Ages. What I found here is mostly some scattered references to the fact they existed. Medieval sources hardly tell you how these troops were employed in combat from a doctrinal point of view, and thus you don't really get the deal by itself. You have to form yourself an opinion, as I've tried to show on the basis of I've provided you with today. How, right? And making, reasoning a bit by analogy with all the risks that it entails, making some kind of broader consideration of what I already know about the rest of warfare at the time, and trying to make sense of what we see from the sources and what military logic suggests, and coming up with a conclusion, right? Because otherwise you'll hardly ever find the book titled, let's talk about mounted crossbowmen in the 13th century everywhere, right? It's just something that historians do not do anymore. I mean, it's something I could do personally. Like if I chose something else that was kind of more sensible and more interesting, right? In my opinion. But it takes really somebody who studies, say, continuously every day for 4 years, paid to produce also, with some discipline, an important scientific work, to arrive to the point of gathering the comprehensive understanding and knowledge of all the thing. And it's very difficult to do, and the reason why I didn't do it is, again, because I would have studied at that point just the crossbowmen, not the rest of the armies per se. And that's why I could have factually, I don't think, ever done it, because how would I even done it to study the entire 13th century sources production? It's impossible, right? So I would have just probably listed the amount crossbowmen appear, but hardly understanding, or maybe even succeeding at some point to understand how they were more generally employed in practice. But I would have just known that the sources would have not given me the full answer, and I would have needed to know the entire 13th century warfare in detail to come up with a sensible explanation. I studied, for example, this in my own thesis. I was studying just 60 years of a specific region, and I didn't have any information about mounted crossbowmen and employment factually. I knew them just because the sources told me, look, this army had, 100 knights, 50 mounted crossbowmen, and that's it. Then, any information on mounted crossbowmen in battle, I think I didn't find even one once on thousands of engagements. And this is interesting because, again, by itself it's a historical evidence, because it tells you that probably these mounted crossbowmen in the broader balance weren't this big deal, right? And also it teaches you how they really made war that was instead mostly about this, cooperation between the battle lines and, cavalry, infantry, cooperation and so on, and not really something more specific, right? So my advice is, as always, never insist on the presumption that you will find the mechanistic, technologistic explanation from the sources, because the sources that were intelligent differently from us never tell you, because it didn't matter. They show you that it was not the point. They tell you something else. Concentrate on that something else, right? But I'm glad, however, we managed to talk about this. Again, my I wish I had filled this video with pictures of beautiful images of illuminations of mounted crossbowmen from the 13th century, but that degree of specificity unfortunately escapes our copyright-free or copyright, let's say, usable type of material uploaded online. And however, it won't be this to stop the thing. For today, I stop it here myself. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.